Welcome back to Critic Proof. I'm your host, Alyssa Rosenberg, the features editor at Think Progress and the television columnist at Women in Hollywood, and I am joined today by Dan Drezner, professor of international politics at Tufts University and author of the surprisingly relevant for today, Theories of International Politics and Zombies. And we are going to kick off with a discussion of Nelson Mandela, who we lost last week, and who is of interest both as a cultural figure and as an important player in the world of international politics. I'd be curious sort of when Mandela first became an important figure to you, because I feel like everyone has sort of a Mandela story, and I realize that's maybe sort of a strange place to start, but
no, it's not strange. I'm going to feel awkward because it dates me. In that, I think my first sort of recognition of Mandela was when I went to college, which was the late '80s, which was the sort of peak of the anti-apartheid divestment movement on campuses, and there was a debate. There was a genuine debate about whether or not Mandela was, deserved the sort of iconic status that he was given, in the sense that, he wasn't like, let's say, Václav Havel or Mahatma Gandhi, in that he didn't seem to be just strictly, preaching nonviolence or resistance. Right. And the ANC, was clearly linked to communist parties at the time. That said, I do think, there was a general recognition of, the apartheid regime is probably worse. But I think there was genuine nervousness, I remember, about what South Africa would look like if Mandela was released. And then, I think after that, the obvious, I'm sure the other moment I remember, and, was just this moment in early 1990 when Mandela walked out of the prison. And that, in my lifetime, there are very few periods where you just had good news story after good news story after good news story, and that was probably the cherry on the top of the sundae for that year.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I vaguely remember Mandela's release. And you can yell at me if you want, I was 6 at the time.
You were 6 at the time?
So,
well, I went to college when I was 10, actually. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
So we're very close.
Yes, exactly.
But it was it was interesting for me in college reading Long Walk to Freedom for the first time, both because of, I think, sort of how clear-eyed it is. Mm-hmm. It's a memoir by a great person who also seems to have a great deal of self-knowledge. And I think, like a lot of young people, I sort of grew up with the idea of Mandela as solely a peaceful person. And so reading his own account of his work with Umkhonto we Sizwe and sort of his evolution away from nonviolence through his work in the ANC, I think was really striking sort of as a young activist and as a student, seeing someone who wasn't particularly interested in erasing that part of his history and was very sort of clear-eyed about it. I went to Yale, and that's a campus where I think the memory of the divestment campaign is still really clear, in part because of how much it divided students and the administration. Yeah. The tent city that was built to protest Yale's investment in South African industries was actually lit on fire by a disgruntled graduate. And it's hard to imagine that kind of, I think, really sort of scary violence happening on, an American campus today. But it was definitely something that people kept in mind, that, the president of the university had threatened to bulldoze the students out, and that, the tent city was set on fire. And it, so I think Mandela was very much a part of my political consciousness in college, even though, he had served his term as president of South Africa by that point. It's a long shadow.
I would say two things. The first is that I'm amused about the sort of, not amused, but the tensions you describe at Yale. What I remember, there were genuine disagreements about not so much the idea of getting rid of the anti-apartheid regime, but the utility of the divestment regime or the divestment strategy. Yeah. But the other thing was that there was this debate about whether this was really, it was always about, this was just a pale echo of the student movements of the 1960s. So there was that thing. But I think the more interesting thing you point out was this notion that the extent to which Mandela had considerable amounts of self-knowledge, that you talk about in his memoir. There's no doubt that came from his imprisonment. Every narrative you read about Mandela is prison changed him in truly, transformative ways. And in some ways, it was prison that turned Mandela from a from a polarizing figure to a transformative one, which is not to whitewash or to forget the fact that, he was potentially polarizing going in. And more importantly, that he was, in many ways still very politically crafty after he was out of prison as well. But that he did well by doing good, that he recognized that a politics of forgiveness was absolutely necessary for South Africa to have any kind of viable future.
Well, and there's also, I think, something very interesting about the idea that liberation movements sort of need a saint or a martyr. And so it can be a conscious decision to offer your life up as that story. And that means that you lose control of some of your own life and some of your own narrative. I mean, so many people have written that Mandela would have hated sort of the way that he's been turned into Santa Claus or a saint after his death. But, I think you understand going in that if you are going to be sort of this void onto which people can project their hopes and fears, which, when you're in prison for 27 years and you have very little contact with the outside world during that time, one of the best things you can do is serve as a void. But that, it's not all cake and candy, giving up sort of control of your life and the narrative of your life.
Although I have to,
for a larger political
I will say the interesting, in some ways, I think what I find fascinating is Mandela's narrative is obviously, it's gripping, but it's also, I'd be curious about your take about this. It was, the other thing that was striking is the evolution of Winnie Mandela's sort of perception, because, in the 80s, she was, she was also equally as much of an icon. But it was clear that after Mandela got released, and it's striking that the extent to which her sort of star fell, for a variety of reasons, some of which was that she was radicalized, some was allegations of corruption. They eventually got divorced. And it does strike me as interesting the extent to which the eulogies and sort of remembrance of Mandela doesn't, erase Winnie Mandela. But Winnie Mandela is a more complicated story. We know what to do with the narrative of Nelson Mandela. Angry young man, learns about self, becomes truly great political leader. Winnie Mandela is a much more confusing narrative in some ways, and it's harder to place her in a particular archetype.
Well, and I think it's, again, to sort of start in the personal. One of the things that Mandela is very, very clear about in Long Walk to Freedom is that in his first two marriages, he was a rotten husband and father. And, his marriage to Winnie was mostly conducted behind bars. And in a way, I think, I would never say Mandela was lucky to go to prison, but in terms of his long-term legacy, prison protected him from a lot of the paths that he could have walked down.
Yes, no, that's very true.
And, Winnie is sort of on the outside. She, is sort of in a position where she has to represent the Mandela family, but with very little support from or contact from her husband. And I think one thing I've been sort of disappointed to see in the conversations about Mandela's legacy, I think people who are coming to this story now and don't have a lot of sort of grounding in South African politics, there isn't a lot of discussion about the tension between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party, for example. There's a lot more going on here than just the ANC versus apartheid. And, we have a sense of sort of the student strikes that are taking place while Mandela's in prison. There's a lot going on there. And so Winnie is, I think, outside with an enormous number of responsibilities, with very, without necessarily the emotional or resources that she needed. And she goes down a path that Mandela easily could have gone down if he were free. And I think it's important to be clear, as much as I sympathize, with someone who's in that marriage and in that situation, Winnie Mandela has people murdered. She endorses the practice of covering people in tires, covering them in gasoline and setting them on fire.
The necklacing, exactly.
Yeah, and necklacing is, one of the most sort of horrific practices of the apartheid struggle, and she's on board.
Yeah.
I mean,
no, that's why I think she's such a complicating figure, because as you point out, there were, she did not have, she didn't get an easy, she wasn't dealt an easy hand, and there are many ways in which you can, describe why she goes down that road, but clearly in retrospect, it's the wrong, it is clearly the wrong path.
Wildly,
wildly and immorally the wrong path. So I don't have. I think you've mentioned that you in your blog post you talked about the way Mandela has been treated in film and fiction, and there's a movie coming out with Idris Elba and Naomi Harris playing.
Yeah, well, and there's also a recent biopic of Winnie Mandela herself, which I haven't gotten a chance to see since it hasn't screened particularly widely.
Have you seen the Idris Elba Naomi Harris one? Because I would watch them read the phone book, frankly, but I don't know what the.
I'm seeing that's Mandela: A Long Walk to Freedom, which stars Idris Elba as Mandela. That comes out on Thursday, and one thing I've been very interested in is the advertising campaign for that has really emphasized, Mandela's work as a saboteur.
Mm-hmm.
Umkhonto We Sizwe is front and center in the trailers. The advertising for it, has the label troublemaker, which is the translation of, Mandela's Sesotho name. And so, I'm very curious to see how comfortable that movie is with Mandela as a militant, a portion of his life that frankly plays to Idris Elba's acting strength. So I think that's going to be very interesting. I mean, I think sort of all of a sudden we might get a much more nuanced sense of both Mandela and Winnie.
No, it is interesting timing. I agree.
The
thing I'm struck. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, the thing I'm struck by, I was going to talk about this, is that the thing about seeing the trailer. I've only seen the trailer for it, but it's clear. It's a movie that encompasses all of Mandela's sort of political life. And I was thinking, watching it, that's an increasingly rare genre in movies. That the sort of the biopic where you start from a person's beginnings and then go to where they get to greatness. Like the Gandhi, the Ben Kingsley, Richard Attenborough Gandhi style thing is increasingly rare, which I actually think is a good thing, because those are incredibly hard movies to pull off. And the contrast, I think, is Spielberg's Lincoln. Which I think, and it was he who clearly made the right call to say, let's focus on these few months, because by doing so, you don't have to deal with the aging thing or the prosthetics or anything like that. I mean, you did with
you don't have to have him go knock down.
Right, exactly. You have to deal with the montage, but at the same time, they did it so that you could clearly see every facet of Lincoln in that aspect. And I suppose the equivalent of Mandela, it's not as good of a movie, but still, I liked Invictus. Because again, it focuses on a similar sort of, shorter, concentrated period. And in some ways, the key sort of moment for Mandela when he takes power and then exercises, I think more restraint than perhaps his ANC allies would have expected him to.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think you're right to sing, those two approaches. I think that the anecdotal approach lets you dive much deeper into a decision.
Right.
I mean, part of what's good about Lincoln is, the arguments and the decision-making process and seeing how, Lincoln arrives at a destination. I think, the King's Speech does another interesting job of sort of, walking Edward through a seminal moment. And I think that you can do sort of much richer storytelling without becoming sort of a flip book. I think the other thing is that the arc of everybody's life is not necessarily that interesting. Right. I don't know that I find the political arc or the arc of Margaret Thatcher's life necessarily that interesting. I'd almost rather have seen, Meryl Streep play her during the Falklands War or something. Exactly. Something where it's a revealing moment. It also gives you more space to pull in other people. I mean, part of the reason that Lincoln is a lot of fun is that you get to see all of these other figures, you get to have, Walton Goggins playing a Southern congressman, you get a bigger sense of the world because other people influence those decisions, because you need to persuade other people in a given moment.
Right.
And I think that can make for sort of richer historical storytelling. I mean, I do think Mandela is one of the people who actually has a life that is sort of interesting in the long arc.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And revealing in the long arc. And so I'll be curious to see how well they play that out. But I think that it's been good to see that shift towards, what actually counts as an interesting story, because most people's lives are not interesting, soup to nuts, even world historical people.
Right. No, as I said, I mean, I agree with you. It's not like you can't do the biopic. I mean, I think it's still possible to do it well, but you're right. I mean, outside of people like Gandhi or Mandela, it's tougher. You really, I mean, you need I think only in rare exceptions. So on the whole, I like this shift. But you also made another point in your post, which I agree with, and I think in some ways the best sort of fictionalized treatment of Mandela I've seen was what Max Brooks did to him in World War Z, where he's he only makes a cameo appearance, but it's an important one.
And he's not even by his English name.
Right.
It's his. There's a reference to his Sesotho name, but there's, he doesn't actually say it's Nelson Mandela,
right.
Which I think is.
But it was, you're reading, if you have any kind of geopolitical awareness, it's clearly Mandela, where they bring in this white Afrikaans strategist who has devised this truly ruthless plan to defeat the zombies. And the thing I like about it is that, you see Mandela embracing him and saying this will be the savior of our country. And it clearly, shifts the room towards that embrace of that strategy. But I also like the coda, which is you never see Rediker again. And the clear implication is that, they kept him and then that was that. So I actually think that's useful also to demonstrate Mandela's simultaneous, his gift of forgiveness, but also the fact that he was a political strategist. And in some way, I think I pointed this out on Twitter yesterday. It was Fareed Zakaria who pointed out on his show yesterday. It's true. In some ways, I think the most underemphasized aspect of Mandela's legacy was the fact that he left power voluntarily. That is not necessarily the norm, particularly for leaders of independence in sub-Saharan Africa. And, the contrast to, let's say, Robert Mugabe in particular is rather strong, which is not to say he did it because he knew the ANC was going to continue to rule South Africa, but still he didn't have to do that. And so in some ways that was a great moment.
Well, and I think one of the things that's very interesting about the retrospective pieces that are being published now about Mandela's family is there's this expectation embedded in a lot of them that, his children from his various marriages, most of which he wasn't around to raise or have contact with, should in some way be involved in South African politics. And that's a very strange assumption for a democracy rather than a hereditary monarchy, right? I mean,
well, now wait a minute. We're talking about we're operating in a universe where Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush might run. So, you're right that in theory we don't operate in a hereditary monarchy, but still, it's, I don't know if the contrast is quite as bright lined as we would like to think.
Sure. I mean, but let me put it this way. Barbara and Jenna Bush seem a lot happier for not having the expectation that they're supposed to follow their father into politics. Yes,
that's fair.
And,
okay.
And Jenna, who's done, very good charity and sort of international advocacy work, is engaged, but in a different way than her father was. And, not everybody is up to work in politics, be they tribal or be they national. And, if there's anyone who sort of earned kind of doing whatever they want, I kind of think it's the Mandela kids.
Yeah, no, that's true. And it is interesting. I mean, actually, this would be an interesting book project, is to write about literally the children of sort of these kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, sainted leaders. Not to imply they were saints, but rather, after the fact. I mean, think about the Martin Luther King children for whom, they have not necessarily borne the King legacy terribly well. Or on the other hand, you have the Nehru line in India, which is still clearly in politics. It would be an interesting set of contrasts, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just one of the other ways that our sort of expectations are coming out in very sort of complicated ways. I wanted to go back to something you said about sort of movies about Mandela, because I think one of the interesting things about Mandela is not just that he left power voluntarily, but that, frankly, for a transformative revolutionary leader, that he lived as long as he did. I mean, that Mandela not only left power voluntarily, but that he died peacefully of old age is sort of a remarkable thing. And it means it's influenced, I think, the cultural depictions of him in some interesting ways, because people are obviously very hungry to depict Mandela. There have been, a lot of efforts to do so. Sidney Poitier played him. in a movie about Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. But you can't make sort of a definitive movie about someone until their life is over, right? Until they've stopped evolving and stopped changing.
Right.
And I would be very curious to see, we've had this sort of little uptick in Mandela projects towards his death, but I wonder if we'll see sort of an explosion of cultural responses to his life. I mean, I would be very curious about the novels that, J.M. Coetzee or Nadine Gordimer would write about Nelson Mandela. I'm curious about the movies. I think that's I
have to say, I suspect this is going to be a function of, frankly, how well the Idris Elba, Naomi Harris film does. I mean, let's be honest. If there's interest, then you're going to see, at least on the film side, I think, that'll.
Sure, well, getting a film project up and going is
exactly.
an entirely different thing.
But I mean, like in terms of novels, and I think actually the thing I'm really looking forward to is just sort of, who comes out with the definitive biography of Mandela, because now you can do it. And so, and that's it. I mean, on the nonfiction side, but also I think you can probably do it in a fictionalized way that'll also be interesting. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah. I mean, there's so little interest in African storytelling, just generally. There's fabulous science fiction by African authors that I read all the time that is never in a place to sort of jump to feature film development. HBO did The Number One Ladies Detective Agency, which I think is terrific, and which nobody watched and died almost immediately. I wonder...
And there was District 9 as well.
Yeah. And Neil Blomkamp, I think, is going back to set his next movie in a futuristic South Africa. It's called Chappie. I don't know much more about it than that. But, Blomkamp is really interesting. I mean, what did you think of District 9?
I have an awful confession to make. I have not seen District 9. I know.
Oh, man.
I know. I've been bad on that. But you now guilted me. I will try to go see it, or I'll try to watch it on demand. But I'd rather not. It was just one of those things where the opportunity never arose. I actually don't think I haven't seen Elysium either. So
Elysium is okay. What I think is really interesting about District 9 is sort of its reflection on post-apartheid politics, which is so the idea is that a ship full of aliens who are sort of worker bee levels.
Right. No, I know the basic plot.
Sure. But just for our listeners at home.
Right.
So, it crash lands in South Africa. It sort of gets stalled out over, I think the idea is that it's over one of the townships. And a post-apartheid South Africa takes the opportunity for national unification by bringing everyone of all races together to oppress the aliens.
Yes, exactly. Nothing like an outsider to bring everything together.
Yes, and it's very interesting in that it suggests that there is, that Black South Africans are almost sort of working out an urge for retribution by getting the chance to oppress somebody else. It's also a movie that, stepped into another sort of controversy that I think was not familiar to most American viewers, but in the alien slums, it sets up Nigerians as sort of the interlocutors between, illicit human trade and the aliens. You have Nigerian prostitutes and Nigerian drug lords. And it was I found it sort of uncomfortable to see, this movie kind of bring in an kind of intra-African stereotype about Nigerians that may not have been legible to an American audience, but that was very much there. Yeah. And so,
well, this is always a tricky. I think it's Laura Say, who's a Africanist political scientist now at Colby, who's very, very sharp on this stuff. Talks about one of the problems with sort of traditional Western narratives about sub-Saharan Africa and how. Yeah, basically, I always like checking her Twitter feed whenever there's like a big Africa story to see whether or not. The coverage consists only of stereotypes or if there's actually anything more interesting going on.
Yeah. No, if nothing else, it would be exciting and edifying to see Mandela's death get more people interested in South Africa, in African storytelling. Because there's a lot of, there's great stuff coming out of there. And Dio Apate, who I think is done Blogging Head some, has a book coming out called The Bright Continent about innovation in Africa. And I think I'll be very curious to read
No,
that.
I mean, and a related point, which is, again, Mandela represents in some ways a successful example of, sub-Saharan African governance. That you can obviously quibble with his legacy, particularly on treatment of HIV/AIDS, but still, he was a successful political leader and a successful, policymaker. And I agree with you. It would be nice if there was a focus on that because it, again, alters the perceptions that people have of sub-Saharan Africa, which actually economically has had a pretty good decade, and looks like it will continue to have a pretty good decade. Now, in some cases, that's in spite of policymakers, but in other cases, it's because of them. And so that way, the idea that instead of just being this undifferentiated, landscape where all you see is poverty and famine, the idea that it's actually a more dynamic economy than that, I wouldn't be upset if that perception began to take hold.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to hope, though, that sort of a news cycle will re-engage readers with policy or with art. I mean, that's one of the things that I think you learn if you blog or if you write, that the long tail of events like these is somewhat limited, unfortunately, which can be frustrating. I mean, there's so much there. I spent this weekend just going back through my bookshelves and looking back at Desmond Tutu's book about chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Anchi Krog's great memoir about covering it. I mean, there's so much there that I haven't picked up for years, but...
Well, it's interesting that you talk about the long tail, because this is a potential way to segue to the next topic, which is the incredibly long tail. I believe it's the 10th anniversary of the release of Love Actually.
Yes, which visited a scourge of ensemble romantic comedies upon our shores.
Yes, and so you are now engaged in a fierce online debate with Chris Orr over the relative merits of this film.
Well, you were the one who wanted to talk about Love Actually, so start out, fire away.
Well, okay, so to summarize the state of the debate, Chris Orr has basically, wrote something to The Atlantic, kind of stunned at the fact that now Love Actually is viewed at, in some ways, this sort of now Christmas staple that you have to watch. In some ways, not exactly like, but kind of like a Christmas story that has found a second life on cable. And his point is that it's the worst romantic movie ever made, that it's actually anti-romantic, that with the exception of a few of the I mean, there's so many plot lines, obviously everyone's going to like something, but that the main romantic plot lines, Orr talks about, he says, there is no actual romantic plotline. It's just the notion that declaration of love leads to love itself. That's all you need to do.
Yes.
And you push back on this, pointing out a couple of different plot lines. The one involving.
So I'm the weirdo who loves Love Actually because I think it's a really sad movie. There are
sad plot lines. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, there are three sort of sad plot lines that
you talked about. Right. Exactly.
Exactly. That to me sort of rise above the rest of the film. And I would never deny that, the movie is full of weird relationships between powerful men and their subordinates, that, the idea that you would go to Portugal on Christmas Eve to propose to your housekeeper who you've, never had an actual substantive conversation is bananas. I can grant you that, and I say this as a woman with great and enduring reserves of love for Colin Firth. The idea that Colin Frissell is going to go to America and find himself, awash in horny ladies is a fantasy that's out of, some of the darker subreddits that we have right now. But, so the three sad subplots involve Emma Thompson as sort of middle-aged stay-at-home mom whose husband, Alan Rickman, finds himself sort of drawn into a flirtation with a coworker who is just a psycho creation. Like, Mia is not an actual human being. I think most American women don't go around opening their legs at their bosses and being like, our holiday party is full of dark corners for doing dark deeds. People don't talk like this. This is not a real thing. But, Emma Thompson's character, who clearly is not feeling that terrific about herself, even as she's sort of taking care of everyone else, discovers this flirtation and is really wounded by it.
In that sense, you and I and Chris Orr agree that is the most powerful scene in the movie, where she goes into the room and cries for a brief moment and then recomposes herself.
To Joni Mitchell. Let's be clear, to Joni Mitchell. I think this is a case of Thompson working somewhat above her material. Although any movie that has her ask a small child whether there was more than one lobster present at the birth of Jesus is doing something right. But, you know, I think she brings a lot to that and brings, you know, I think to me that subplot has always been about, you know, the need for kind of self-care. Mm-hmm. And, you know, her character's rushing around taking care of Liam Neeson, who's been recently widowed. She's taking care of her brother, the, you know, ass-kicking British Prime Minister, who's played by Hugh Grant. And nobody's taking care of her, but in part because she's not asking anybody to do it. You know, she's sort of disappeared into taking care of everybody else. And it's genuinely sad and scary. I mean, I look to that subplot of the movie not so much as like, you know, this is how love works, but I think this is how love falls apart.
I don't know. I mean, I agree with you that is without question the saddest subplot of the movie. Although I disagree with you on your interpretation. I mean, in some ways, the question about the subplot hinges crucially on what you think happened when in the very final scene when like everyone's coming in, you know, landing at Heathrow and they all see each other, and when, you know, the Alan Rickman character, you know, joins his family. I think you interpreted that as in a much more hopeful way than I did. I saw it as, you know, and I think it was played as this is clearly a couple that is staying together because of the children. And it is not that they are radically unhappy, but it is clear they are constrained in their happiness. And that is what.
Sure, I don't think that their marriage is fixed in the final scene of the movie. I mean, I don't think that's an easy reconciliation. Yeah. I mean, his question about how she's doing is very tentative, and her "I'm fine" is very clear.
Yes,
but what I think is interesting about that scene is she's clearly taking care of herself more.
Right, which
she's wearing the kind of dangly earrings that she only wore at the Christmas party in the movie. Her hair styled. She's wearing more bright colors.
This is where I will bow down to you. This is the difference between me watching this movie and you watching this movie, because I read that and I was like, I'm going to have to watch it again because I did not notice that in that. Yeah, I've seen the movie. The thing I like about Love Actually is Love Actually, in my opinion, falls under – it's not a great movie by any stretch of the imagination. What it falls under is what I would call comfort food movies. Which is if you stumble across it on cable when you're flipping channels late at night.
You can just fall into it.
Yes, exactly. And it doesn't matter that you haven't seen the first half or the first or whatever. You know, you could just pick up and, you know, yes, there are plot lines that are totally annoying, but there are plot lines that are incredibly affecting. My favorite actually is, you talked about this as well, and I actually agree, this is the one I agree with you the most on, is the one involving Andrew Lincoln and Keira Knightley.
Yes.
Where it turns out that he's the best man for the husband played by, and I cannot pronounce his name, but
Chiwetel Ejiofor.
Yes, who's just a fantastic actor. Who's married to Keira Knightley, and it turns out that he's been swooning and mooning over Keira Knightley for time immemorial.
Forever, despite the fact that he doesn't know her at all.
Like, well, we don't know he doesn't know her at all. You're right. Yes, I mean, it is. That part is very Hollywood of just sort of gazing from afar and liking her tremendously. But I was very much charmed by the final, sequence in which he sort of just expresses his devotion for her, or his, he basically makes this, bold declaration of love with the clear understanding when he does this that he does not expect this to go anywhere, that he just wants to make it clear to her once and for all that he thinks she is, wonderful and perfect and so forth. And then you quibbled about the kiss. I actually thought it was more of a sympathy kiss in the sense of, it was an appreciation for the gesture.
Oh, no. I think it's – I mean, I wish it wasn't there. I think it would be better if he didn't get rewarded for doing this sort of creepy thing. Yeah. But I do think it's a consolation gesture. This is very sweet of you. I'm going to go back into my extremely attractive husband.
Yes. But I agree with you. The best line in that is after that when he, just says to himself, enough now, which I thought was wonderful. In the sense of, and you're right. I mean, part of the problem with these kinds of movies is there's a very fine line between, winning flirtation and creepy stalkery stuff. So, there's a way in which, it's almost like, there was this thing on Twitter, like dark plot, dark recaps. You could do so much with Love Actually as a dark recap, silent.
They're like 10 years
later.
Right,
exactly, yes. But that said, the way they play it and the way, you actually get the sense that the Andrew Lincoln character has some closure, which is not necessarily easy given that development.
Well, and I think one of the reasons that plotline works instead of being extremely disturbing is that he knows that what he's doing is
right,
creepy.
exactly, yes.
You know, I mean, there's the scene at the wedding where Laura Linney asks Lincoln if he's in love with Ejiofor's character. Mm-hmm. You know, he tries to avoid showing Juliet this wedding video because he knows that it's creepy, that it only focuses on her. You know, he sort of runs out the first time.
Right, and he actually says it's self-preservation as to why he doesn't talk to her, which again, you're right. It's the sense of self-awareness in that character that makes it, that doesn't, make it creepy stalkery. It's that he knows he's being creepy stalkery and he wishes he could not.
Right. And he's not, I mean, he's staying away from her. There's the scene where Ejiofor's character, encourages him to talk to Juliet and be nice to her. And part of the reason he's staying away is because he knows his feelings are inappropriate. Yeah. And I think, the sort of, I think it's a fairly effective purging of, an unrealistic crush that, but while still acknowledging that those kind of crushes can affect someone very, very deeply.
Right. In some ways, calling it a crush isn't fair because, obsession also doesn't work. But there's, it describes this kind of relationship that,
it's an infatuation.
Yeah, good. Okay, that's fair. Basically, I side with you on this, which is that, again, it's far from perfect movie, but that said, particularly this month, I actually do enjoy watching it in surprising ways.
How do you feel about the Laura Linney subplot? Because this is one that I think is very divisive and one where Orr and I read it very differently. Linney's character, Sarah, lives in the UK. She doesn't have extended family there. Her brother is obviously quite seriously mentally ill. And, she kind of has let his demands on her take over her life. She always answers the phone for him. She'll go there whenever he needs her. And Orr, I thought, had a sort of unsympathetic reading of the character, which is, why can't she just hang up the phone already and make out with her hot coworker, played by Rodrigo Santoro. And to me, that didn't quite get what was going on there. I mean, Linney's character isn't without agency, but, she feels a real obligation to her brother, and sounds genuinely frightened for him when he, is threatened. Whatever he's saying on the other end of the line scares her and upsets her. And, I felt a certain amount of sympathy for a character who's kind of let her life be eaten up by taking care of someone else. Which I think is a common theme in both the Linney and the Thompson subplots.
I would say two things. First, for me, one of the more heartbreaking scenes is when you actually see her with her brother. Because at one point her brother does start to try to hit her, and it's clear, it was a very short scene, but it very effectively sort of characterized what, was the state of his mental illness and the ways in which, from the outside, this has got to look like just the most exhausting emotional roller coaster possible. I would say, and the pivotal scene is obviously where she finally gets to take her man crush home. And again, one of the funnier scenes is when she, she invites him in and then she goes away into her, out of his sight. And then she has this little moment of exaltation, which, was just a great moment of physical comedy by Laura Linney. But I tend to side more with you on this, which is I think the pivotal scene in which he finally, when the Rodrigo Santiago character finally leaves, I sort of looked at him and thought, dude, you're being a dick. What the hell? I mean, if you're actually interested in her, presumably you would be willing to wait for the conversation to end. And
I mean, she even explains to him what's happening, what with there being no parents and all, which again is sort of a great oblique phrasing. I mean, Love Actually is a cheesy movie, but it has a lot of great little writing around the margin.
I will say, I mean, in some ways, the thing I've always liked about the Richard Curtis movies is that, yes, they're romantic comedies, but there is also very clearly room for sadness in them. In which, which is not necessarily the case in most romantic comedies. I don't know how you felt about Enough Said, but I went to see it last month, and I was struck watching it. I was utterly enchanted by it. But the thing that I was stunned by watching that movie was the extent to which just the first 10 minutes between Julia Louis-Dreyfus and James Gandolfini had more chemistry between the two of them than almost the past decade of romantic comedies the two leads put together. It was just astonishing the extent to which the two of them actually clearly were interacting as people in a way that, if you watch a Katherine Heigl movie, it doesn't quite happen. Well,
I also think one thing that's interesting about the sort of current state of romantic comedies, and this I think goes with some larger trends in movies. I mean, I think we've seen action movies get increasingly destructively violent to try and give people a sense of thrill, where romantic comedies have started kind of making mountains out of molehills. Like, if a woman is a career woman, she must be neurotic in ways that have completely messed with her love life. If a man has had his heart broken once,
that's it. He's scarred for life. Will never get back in the game again. Yeah.
Well, and he's turned into sort of a misogynistic creep who needs to be rescued by, sex with a good woman.
Right.
And what I like about Love Actually, and what I think is actually even better done in The Best Man Holiday, which is a movie with its own completely doofy excesses, is that adults have real problems in them. A mentally ill brother and no other family to help take care of him is a real issue. A husband's sort of slowly drifting affection is a real issue.
It doesn't feel like they don't feel like contrivances.
Yeah. Right, and it doesn't feel like their emotional. It doesn't feel like the characters' emotional reactions to circumstances have been manipulated for the sake of the movie.
I would also add, this is the miracle of Enough Said, because in some ways Enough Said rests on a plot contrivance. I mean, if you describe that movie to someone else, it really does sound like almost like a sitcom pilot. Yet the acting and the writing is just so good that you forget it. It doesn't matter because the characters are so lived in that you can. The great thing about the Julia Louis-Dreyfus character in particular was you can almost see on her face her recognition that what she is doing is stupid and counterproductive, and yet she does it.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I liked about The Best Man Holiday is that the characters have real problems. Harper, the main character, was like an adjunct who's been laid off by NYU. His first baby is coming. And his publishers just rejected his latest book since the previous one wasn't a big enough hit. And he doesn't have enough money to take care of the kid that's coming, and he's really scared, in the movie.
I have to watch this. I didn't know there was an academic character. I have a thing for watching movies with academic characters. It's a pet peeve I have, which I can vent about this to you more than anyone else, which is guaranteed. The Best Man's Holiday, would support this because the characters are African American, but guaranteed if there is a white male academic who is a character in a film or book or TV show, 9 times out of 10 they're banging the student.
Yeah.
And I kind of understand it because it's the one interesting possibility, I guess, for professors. If they were actually to do like an office style show of academics, it would be people typing in front of computers and that would be it. But still
right. Well, you could have Ken Loach make a movie about grad student organization. I mean, that's the thing.
Wait, say that again. You could do what?
You could have Ken Loach make a movie about grad student organization.
Oh, God. But this seems appropriate again to segue because the one area where there's been a bumper crop this year, particularly on television, has been political shows. That
yes,
I discovered, by the way, that if you were to ever fly to Beijing, the best thing you can do is when you should binge watch House of Cards. It was the perfect.
Oh, you should never binge watch House of Cards. House of Cards is terrible.
Well, we can talk about that.
It's not terrible.
But there's been House of Cards. There's been Scandal, which also is good for binge watching.
There's Alpha House on Amazon now.
There's and if you cast back, I think The Good Wife really is much more about politics than people realize, and is
well, and much more about technology.
Yes, and is easily, in my opinion, has been the best show this year by far. Or even shows like Game of Thrones, which are at least about politics in one way or the other.
Tits and dragons and politics.
The best combination. I didn't realize you hated House of Cards. I have much more mixed feelings about it. But what did you hate about it?
Have you seen the British original?
No, I have not. Okay, I've heard nothing but good things about the British original. I grant you that.
The British original is very good, as is State of Play, which was remade into a deeply mediocre American movie.
Yeah, that was an awful movie. Yes.
I just think House of Cards is silly. It employs my least favorite trope, which is the slutty girl blogger.
Yes, okay, I'm totally with you on that. The journalism side of this was I actually didn't find her I found her offensive. I found the slightly older reporter who then tells her, "Oh yeah, I got to where I was because, I was screwing everything."
Right.
That was actually the thing I found totally offensive.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that and, this just shows up everywhere. It showed up in Political Animals.
Yeah.
I mean, every single young female political reporter, is a slutty, ambitious, know nothing. And it's infuriating, I mean.
No. I'm totally on board with that. That was truly fun. Oh, and we should also not forget, is it Alpha House? Yes.
Yes.
That potentially has promise on Amazon Prime. I would say this: what I enjoyed about House of Cards was not that. I agree with you. That was incredibly objectionable. I thought they actually could have done it better if instead of making the Kate Mara character a reporter, she had been a biographer. Because then you could have, at least it would have. There are real life things you could have referred to, but.
Yeah, I mean, I also just think, the one episode in House of Cards that's really interesting is the one where I think it's episode 8.
He goes back to South Carolina. Yeah.
Goes back to South Carolina and his military school, meets up with this character he clearly had a youthful romance with. And it's just sort of this, lovely human episode.
Yes,
They're singing.
It was very affecting, yeah.
He runs around and gets drunk. He acts like a person. Right. And,
it makes you realize what he's given up to pursue the life that he's pursued.
Right. And it's, part of what's interesting at the end of the episode is it's not really clear whether he's better off. But I thought, the show was very cold. I mean, you have sort of Robin Wright as this pneumatic sex bot of a political housewife. It just.
I found the Robin Wright character deeply disturbing and yet also a little bit of a turn on. So that was I have my own issues that I clearly need to work on because that character simultaneously scared the hell out of me, but yet nevertheless was in some ways very alluring.
Yeah,
But let me put it this way.
I think Beau Willimon, who has become the sort of go-to guy to write political fiction about Washington, and he wrote House of Cards. He did, the adaptation of his play, Farragut North, which for my money is one of the worst political movies of any year.
Yeah, that was awful, yes.
I mean, Willimon just has this idea that the darker you go, the more... The
darker equals depth somehow.
The deeper you get into the truth of Washington. And look, there's a lot of, rotten idiocy that happens in Washington, D.C. I lived here. I covered Darrell Issa for a long time.
Sorry, go ahead.
Watching that man turn, a hearing on civil, domestic partner benefits for federal employees into 5 hours of grandstanding and browbeating witnesses is not an edifying experience.
I would say one thing in favor of House of Cards and then one thing where I agree with you. Where I agree with...
Can I finish that thought,
though?
Go ahead. But I think, a lot of what happens in Washington is ludicrous. It's funny. It's silly. And I think mockery is often... a sharper tool to bring to bear on the city than, the idea that we need Batman to come in and punch people and everything will be fine. Yeah. A lot of Willimon's work is sort of Washington via Christopher Nolan to me.
Oh, that's an interesting way of putting it. I like that.
We need devices to lower our voices so we can, all sound more serious about the crisis in Washington.
We have to pass this resolution. Yes. Well, I would say a few things. First, you're right about the satire point. In fact, I think the hardest I laughed this year was the 1 minute Bill Murray cameo in the pilot of Alpha House, which is if you haven't seen I don't know if the pilot is still available for free on Amazon Prime, but I could not. I don't know if I could have laughed harder at the Bill Murray character, but
he plays a disgraced congressman who's forgotten to see the schedule to turn himself in and is trying to get his teeth brushed and get his hair down.
Yes. I mean, and then the last part where Jacob says, "That's just poor staff work." With respect.
That's right.
But with respect to House of Cards, I think it gets one thing wrong, but it does get one important thing right, and it's actually unusual. The thing it gets wrong, I agree with you. The thing that I always find disturbing about shows about Washington, with the exception of The West Wing, because The West Wing is problematic in the other direction, but shows like House of Cards assume that everyone is cynical about everything. And
and nobody has any issues that they actually care
and that's not true. Even the most cold-hearted, realpolitik take on the way things work in Washington, if you don't acknowledge the fact that people actually care about things, then you've got it wrong. Yeah. Because that's not the way it works. And so in that sense,
And House of Cards is so invested in that idea. I mean, Frank Underwood has no
right, exactly. Well, although yes, but this does lead to the other thing, which is the one thing I thought was interesting about House of Cards is that if you actually take step back and look at the entire arc, what it actually did very well though was suggest that policy actually matters. That a crucial part of the Frank Underwood's character's Machiavellian plan was he had to pass the education bill. And the education bill was about something, and it was actually, a significant thing. Or, getting the first African American to be the House Majority Whip. Or getting someone he likes as Secretary of State rather than someone who he thinks is a buffoon. This was the part having gone to Williams, I really didn't like that subplot because it's the Williams guy that loses, but that's a whole separate thing.
I also think the show is very strange in suggesting that an incredibly wealthy finance guy would actually want to be in government. I mean, that's
the Gerald McCraney character, or
yeah,
but I don't think he did want to be in government. I never saw it that way. I think he wanted the thing that I thought was totally implausible about that was the notion that basically the Warren Buffett character and the president could somehow keep a secret friendship that no one would have known about. That's absurd. It would have obviously got.
Well, and also just like, I mean, this is my Frank Underwood murdered somebody.
That's true. Okay.
There's this incredibly weird trope in political shows right now. And Scandal gets a pass because Scandal operates in this like crazy banana Shonda Rhimes universe where, there's a secret spy agency that has power over the presidency. That it's like a crazy fever dream fantasia. That's fine. But Frank Underwood straight up murdered somebody, right? At minimum, he's in a garage with security cameras. So people know that he was with this guy just before he died. You can't get away with that. There would be questions.
Well, it does open with him killing the dog, which although that was a slightly different thing. But yes, I take your I take your point. I guess I would say that traditionally there have not been many good shows about politics. Period. The West Wing was problematic in its own ways. It wasn't it wasn't awful, but it had its own issues. But really, in some ways, it was sui generis. There had not been a lot of good shows about politics. What I find it interesting.
Well, and West Wing does have a theory of change, which is that if you talk very earnestly at people, they will change their minds.
Which is just awful. Whereas, that was not the case with House of Cards. It's a more realistic theory of politics. What I like is, and I'm surprised to say this, is that you're right. None of these shows necessarily gets everything right, but I like that clearly there's an effort being made.
So I used to love Homeland and now am very frustrated by it. But I think one of the best political subplots on television this year has been a character named Senator Andrew Lockhart, who's played by the playwright Tracy Letts, who has showed up this season on Homeland trying to understand what the hell these crazy people in the CIA are doing. And, he has sort of a theory of espionage that it should all be, drones and, data dumps and no real sort of human presence on the ground, which the show, I think, wants us to think is a bad idea, even though watching Carrie Mathison running around Tehran making incredibly stupid decisions suggests that he's actually right. But just having a political figure come into a bureaucracy and try to understand what the career civil servants are doing, I think is both a novel take on politics and it's actually produced some really interesting results on the show.
In some ways, it's a brilliant way. I'm surprised they don't do this more often, but it's a nice way of. I have to say, speaking as someone who spent a year in the government bureaucracy, one of the nice things when you bring an outsider in is it makes you realize, all these things we took for granted are actually kind of strange and weird, and maybe we should rethink them. Not that necessarily anything happens, but it's one of those few moments where you can actually, question your first principles, as it were. And it's also a good way for the show, for a show to make, sort of welcome in new watchers and in some ways have the show apply its own criticisms, as it were.
Yeah, and I think if there's one thing that's really promising to me about the current crop of political shows is that it's an argument that there are many, many ways you can go into government storytelling. You can have the oversight story in Homeland. You can have the sort of political story and the relationship between politics and the media of House of Cards. You can have sort of the farce of Alpha House. And you can have, the optimism of Parks and Recreation, which I still think is the most sort of intellectually important show on television today, both for showing local government and for making the argument that government can actually work, even as it's gone to some sort of dispiriting places this season. So, I think if nothing else, it's exciting to know that shows can do well by coming at government from a lot of different directions. So I do find that heartening, even if I think Frank Underwood.
Right. No, and if nothing else, I have this thing about any show that is not about either cops or DAs I approve of, or forensic investigators I generally approve of. So in that sense, I agree that it's a good thing. Yeah. On that note, this has been a lot of fun, and unfortunately I need to get going. But as always, a pleasure. I enjoy very much reading your blog.
Thank you very much for joining me. This is a treat.